Awesome. Thank you, Var. All right. It's fabulous to see all of you. Welcome back. Once again, I hope you had a magical holiday. And what we're going to do today is we're going to do book 4. And book 4 is a really fascinating and in some ways kind of critically important chapter or book, right? And it's critically important because it deals with 3 big ideas. It deals with 3 big issues. And those big issues, and don't worry, we're going to walk through each of them. But chapter 4 is important because in chapter 4, as we move from chapter 3 to chapter 5, and we go through chapter 4, it deals with 3 really big issues. One, very generally, just this question of happiness, and we don't get into a debate about happiness or a deep discussion about happiness, but we talk about the happiness of the city in general, very loosely, and it's just important. And then 2, the second thing that emerges is the 4 components of a kind of stable city, and we'll talk about that. And then the really important, not the really, but the equally important thing is, for the first time in the Republic, you get the emergence of this idea that the structure of the city, this kind of managed city, this kind of stable city, Socrates calls it a just city, but it's a feverish city that in some ways made just, right? The 4 components of this kind of just city, and we'll talk about that, and also too the emergence of this idea that the city and the soul have the same structure, that there's a direct relationship between the structure and the organization of the city itself. And you'll see what I mean by that, and the individual soul. And then the chapter ends with Plato's kind of articulation of what justice is, a very kind of basic understanding of justice. All right, so those are the kind of the big ideas. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, it's an odd, it's not an odd chapter, but the chapter 4 is kind of, it should come after chapter 5. Okay, it should come after chapter 5. Chapter 4 is kind of like an interruption in the conversation. And so what am I talking about? So at the end of book 3, right? At the end of the book 3, we talked about the famous myth of the metals, right? That the emerging philosopher kings, whoever these emerging philosopher kings are, they have to devise a new poem for the city, not just for the guardians, but for the whole city. Because the city is a feverish city. The city's not a healthy city. It's not a purely just city. It's a feverish city that they are trying to somehow make just, or make stable, or make orderly. And to do that, this feverish city is going to require a noble lie, a massive noble lie called the myth of the metals. And as we said, the story goes, when people were underground before they were born, the gods put gold into some souls. They will be the philosopher kings. They put silver into some souls. Those people will become the guardians. And they put bronze into some souls. And those are the people who labor and produce wealth and produce goods and services in the Republic. And the myth of the metals, which is a lie, it's a noble lie, right? It's a noble lie contrived by the potential, the emerging philosopher kings to explain the mythology and the poetry, the story of the city, because the cities need stories. Human beings need stories. They need myths. And then the big question is, what kind of myths are they? Are they myths that do harm, like the Homeric myths, or are they salutary myths, right? Are they noble lies that, while they're still lies, at least do some good? They heal the wound of ignorance and arrogance. And so that was the end, right? And then right at the end of chapter 3, there's this kind of discussion. There's the beginning of the discussion that will ultimately be in book 5, right? But there's a beginning of a discussion at the end of book 3 about how the guardians are going to live. And it's this whole idea of families in common, no private property. And they start to have that discussion, okay? And that's where book 3 ends. And then book 4 starts, right, with Adeimantus interrupting. Socrates is about to talk. Socrates is about to talk about how the guardians will live. We've talked about the poetry. We've talked about the music we're going to teach them. We've talked about the myths we're going to teach them, right? And then Socrates is going to start talking about how they will live, okay? We could call the institutions. And that conversation we're going to have on Thursday. That's in book 5. But we don't get there. This is why book 4 is kind of an odd moment. We don't get there because Adeimantus interrupts Socrates, right? And right on page 97, right, on page 97 at the beginning of book 4, Socrates is talking. We've just talked about the myth of the metals. We've introduced this idea about families and property in common, right? And Socrates is about to begin that, and Adeimantus interrupts him. And he says, and Adeimantus interrupted and said, Socrates, this is extraordinary, the story you're telling. And Adeimantus says, Socrates, what would be your apology? What would be your defense? What would be your explanation, right? What would your explanation be, Socrates, if someone were to say that you're hardly making these men happy? And he's referring to the guardians, right? So everything we've been talking about are the guardians, because we have to educate them in a specific way, because they're people who are going to be trained to go and get the things we want but don't need. And the biggest concern is that they're well trained, they're well brainwashed, they've got the noble lie, so they don't ultimately want, so they don't turn against the city, so they don't want what we have in the city, right? And so, and Adeimantus and Glaucon and Adeimantus and Pleromachus, they're listening to this, and Adeimantus says, my God, right? You don't seem, right? What would you say, Socrates, if someone were to say to you that you're hardly making the guardians happy? And further, Adeimantus says that it's their own fault. It's the guardians' fault. They, right, and here's the key line, right? They, the guardians, to whom the city in truth belongs. Right? And why, in a weird and a strange word use of the word truth, why in truth does the city belong to the guardians? Because of what we just said. Ultimately, they're going to possess this extraordinary power, right? They're trained to go and kill other people to get the things we want but don't need, right? Which means ultimately, at any time, should they want power in the city, should they want the wealth of the city, should they not want just to be guardians anymore, they possess the raw material power and the training to take it. There's nothing stopping them. Just like you see in all sorts of military dictatorships all around the world, right? And Adeimantus says, well, what would you say, Socrates, if someone were to say to you that you're not making the guardians happy? And further, it's their fault. They, the guardians, to whom the city in truth belongs, but who enjoy nothing good from the city as do others. Right? And who are those others? They're the laborers who possess lands and build fine big houses and possess all the accessories that go along with these things. Right? Right? The guardians, how do you explain that the guardians are going to be happy? Right? And Socrates says on the bottom of the page, and Socrates says, you're right. He says, yes, I said. And besides, Socrates says, speaking to the guardians, they do what they do for food alone. The guardians do what they do for food alone. They get no wages beyond the food, as do the rest. So if they should wish to make a private trip away from home, it won't be possible. Or if they want to give private gifts, it won't be possible. All right. So what's this question about happiness? Right? Adamantis says, you don't seem to be making the guardians very happy. And then the top of page 98, Socrates says, well, you're right. From a certain point of view. Now, Socrates kind of in a funny way says, well, at the end of the day, these people will probably be the most happy because they're not going to be bothered by their emotions. They're not going to be bothered by their lusts. They're not going to be bothered by their passions, right? And so Socrates says in a kind of sarcastic way, says on the top of 98, he says, well, I suppose that it might turn out that the guardians are the happiest people of all. But here's the key. Here's the whole point of setting this conversation up. Socrates clearly says on the top of page 98, he says, however, in founding the city, in talking about this city that's now being built, this feverish city that they're trying to keep maintained, right? In founding the city, we're not looking to the exceptional happiness of any one group among us, but as far as possible, that of the city as a whole. So the city is going to be comprised. Ultimately, the city is going to be made up of philosopher kings. It's going to be made up of guardians, and it's going to be made up of laborers. Those are the three classes of the city, right? These philosopher kings, the guardians, and the laborers. And the city is not designed to celebrate or privilege or advance the particular happiness of any group. That's not what the city, and by the way, that's not ultimately what justice will be, as we'll see on page 123 to 125, right? And so Socrates says, look, the goal of what we're doing isn't to make one part of the city happy. It's not just that we're creating a city for the laborers to be happy, or we're not just creating a city for the philosopher kings to be happy, and we're certainly not creating a city just for the guardians to be happy. The purpose isn't to design a city that celebrates and advances or is designed for the sole purpose of only one part, right? The purpose of the city is the happiness of the whole. And this is really important. The purpose of the city is the happiness of the whole, right? And he says, so, however, in founding the city, we are not looking to the exceptional happiness of any one group among us, but as far as possible, that of the city as a whole, right? And again, we kind of expect this, right? Because at some point in the past, in book 1, right, Thrasymachus, back in book 1, had argued that justice is the advantage of the stronger, right? At the end of book 1, Thrasymachus had said justice is the advantage of the stronger. And what he meant by that is that those who make the rules to their own advantage, to their own interests. So if the regime is run by a tyrant, the tyrant makes the laws to his advantage. If the city is run by the rich, the oligarchs make the rules and the laws to their advantage to maximize their happiness. Or if the city is run by the demos, the people make the laws to advantage their own privilege, right? And we, of course, we saw Socrates defeat that argument in book 1, but now we see a kind of a return of this. The city is not designed to make one particular part of the city exceptionally happy. The city is designed to make the whole thing happy, for the happiness of the city. The goal is the happiness of the city. And then a couple lines down, Socrates says, we suppose we're trying to fashion a happy city, right? A whole city, right? We're trying to create a city, and remember, it's still a feverish city, right? So we got this feverish city, but somehow we've got to keep it maintained. We got to keep it stable. We got to keep it ordered, right? This is the best that we can do, given the fact that people want their relishes, given the fact that we have to have these guardians, given the fact that we're having a feverish city. What do we have to do to keep the feverish city even kind of happy, even kind of stable, right? And so this is what they're talking about. The city's feverish. We now have these guardians We have to educate them in a certain way so they don't destroy the city, right? We've got all these laborers, right? They're going to produce wealth, but we somehow got to keep them just producing wealth, right? So we got to create the city, right? Ruled by philosopher kings that somehow keeps the whole damn thing together without tearing itself apart. What's the happiness? What's the happiness of the feverish city? How do we keep the feverish city going? How do we keep it stable? How do we keep it ordered? All right. So Socrates says to Adeimantus in the middle of the page, 198, he says, so Adeimantus, he says, don't compel us, don't force us to attach to the guardians, right? Don't demand that we attach to the guardians a happiness that will turn them into everything except guardians, right? Right? The guardians are the guardians, and they got to be educated in a certain way, and they've got to live a certain way. And we'll see that in book 5, right? And their happiness is connected to the city as a whole. In fact, ultimately, that's what Plato's going to conceive of as justice, and we'll get there at the end of the chapter. All right. So the city is designed to make one part whole. And the guardians, as we will see, will have their place in the city. Now, this kind of brings up a kind of important passage in the Republic, and it kind of shows up, right? Because they're talking about the kind of how the city's arranged and what the happiness of the city looks like. And why the guardians can't have wealth, why the guardians ultimately can't have private possessions, why they can't have private families, why they can't share in the wealth. And this gets to this whole issue of wealth, the danger of wealth in the city. And Plato says on page 99 and 100, there are two really extraordinary threats to all cities, right? There are two extraordinary threats. It's either extreme poverty or extreme wealth. Extreme poverty destroys cities because they can't produce the wealth they need to protect themselves or to survive. And extreme wealth destroys the city because just wealth and decadence just ultimately corrupts the city, and the city can't maintain itself. And this gets us to one of the most famous passages in the Republic, and it's the middle of page 100. And Plato says, and they're talking about obviously the happiness of the city, and they're talking about the guardians, but Plato makes this kind of general observation about cities. And he says, if you really look at cities, and America would be a great example, he would be talking about ancient Athens, but we could talk about contemporary America. And right in the middle of 100, Plato says, if you look at cities, Athens or contemporary America, it's not one city. There's never, in most cities, there isn't just one city. There's actually two. There's the poor and there's the wealthy, right? There are two. He says, there's never just one city, right? He says, for each of them is very many cities, but not a city, as those who say. There are two in any case, warring with each other, one of the poor, the other of the rich, right? And in all cities, this is the tension, right? This tension for wealth, and this kind of ongoing, sometimes overt civil war, other times kind of covert tension between the poor and the rich. And all cities are ultimately devoured by this tension. And that's what we have in many ways today in the United States. You've got this extraordinary gap, this inequality of wealth between the 1% and the rest of the 99% of this country, this extraordinary inequality of wealth between the poor, or what used to be the working class, and the wealthy. And you see this tension, the fact that inside America, there's not just one city, there's two cities. and these cities are kind of in conflict with each other, and they're at war with each other, and ultimately this tension and this conflict destroys the city. And Plato is using this as an opportunity to say, look, whatever city we're going to create, we've got to avoid that. We have got to create a city where there isn't this war between the poor and the wealthy. And so, again, I'm just bringing that up. It was a very important moment, and it's relevant to who we are. So now the discussion turns to what this city is going to look like. What does happiness and what does something like justice? Again, it's not pure justice, because this is a feverish city. We're still in an unhealthy city. We're still in a sick city. We're still in a feverish city. But if that's what we're doing, if that's what we're building, how do we keep it stable? How do we maintain it? How do we keep it stable? And how do we keep it kind of happy, right? How do we do it? And so they're still looking for it, right? Because as we said, they're looking for justice in the city, and even a kind of justice even in a feverish city, right? And so what is happiness and something like justice going to look like in this feverish city, right? What's it going to look like, and how is it going to be composed? All right. And this gets us to a conversation, an extremely important conversation, about the 4 elements of the happy city. Okay, there are, and again, I'm using that that term loosely, right? Because clearly it's happy in the sense that it's ultimately being run by philosopher kings who are telling these noble lies, right? So I mean, it's happy in a kind of meta way. It's literally still a feverish city, right? But even in the feverish city, how do we keep it happy? How do we keep it organized? How do we keep it maintained? How do we keep it from devouring itself, right? And this leads us to a discussion in book 4 of the 4 elements of the kind of justice in this feverish city, right? And on page 105, 3/4 of the way down, 105, right? They're saying, okay, what do we need here, right? What does the feverish city need? And also, how does the feverish city need to be organized? How does it need to be organized? Which is really the key here. Okay, we'll see that in a few minutes. So on the bottom of page 105, and on the outline, this is section 2, the emergence of justice in the city, the 4 components. Okay, on the outline, and 3/4 of the way down page 105, Socrates says, well, whatever happiness and whatever justice looks like in this feverish city that we're constructing, again, one that will be governed by philosopher kings who in order to make it kind of happy, to keep it kind of just, have had to deploy all these noble lies, right? And have to keep it, enforced. All right. But so what do we need to do this? The city still needs these 4 things. And what are they? And Socrates says 3/4 towards the bottom on page 105. Socrates says, well, plainly then, this city, right? It's going to be wise, it's going to be courageous, it's going to be moderate, and it's going to be just. All right. Somehow we've got to incorporate. We've got to find and incorporate these 4 components in the city, right? These 4 components. We've got to find wisdom. We've got to find courage. We've got to find a kind of moderation. And then ultimately, here's the argument. From those 3 emerge justice. We're going to get to that in a few minutes, so don't worry about it, okay? Now, I want to just pause here and let you know that this is a metaphor for the soul. Also, this is also a metaphor for the individual. We're not there yet. We're going to talk about it in a few minutes, right? But right now, Socrates is talking about the 4 components of this happy, this just city, right? And we got to find wisdom, we got to find courage, we got to find moderation, and we got to find justice. And we'll talk about it very, very basically as we go to the next page. But this is also a setup for the argument of the individual soul, right? Each individual person, you and I, we have a soul, right? And ultimately, Plato is going to argue, you and I are happy and we are just if in our souls we have identified the source of wisdom, we've identified our source of courage, or what Plato will call spiritedness, what we would call self-discipline. If we understand the relationship between those two things, what they will call moderation, and ultimately that's going to be what justice is. Okay, so as we begin to have this discussion about where do we find those four things in the city, understand perfectly well that we're also simultaneously now talking about the soul. Because in the Republic, the structure of the city and the structure of the soul are the same. Okay, the structure of the city and the structure of the soul are exactly the same. And we'll see that very clearly in a few minutes. But just so you know, this is kind of where we're going. All right, so now we're on the hunt for wisdom, courage, moderation, and then ultimately justice. Okay, are you guys following me? Cool, I love you guys. All right, so let's turn the page. So, and again, this is a kind of a basic discussion. They don't get too deep, but they're just identifying these things in general concepts. So on the top of page 106, he says, wisdom, Socrates says wisdom, right? In my opinion, first comes plainly to light, and it's a kind of knowledge about how to govern. Which wisdom, in my opinion, which first comes to light, and it looks kind of strange, he says, in a couple of lines down, he says, and further, this very thing, it's kind of good counsel. Wisdom is kind of good counsel. It's a kind of a wisdom of how to live. It's a wisdom of how to govern. This very thing, good counsel, is plainly a kind of knowledge. For it's surely not by lack of learning, but by knowledge. It's by knowledge that people govern themselves well. Whatever wisdom's going to be in this city, right? And by the way, we know it's going to be the philosopher kings, right? Right? Whatever wisdom is, right? It's connected to knowledge, and ultimately, what kind of knowledge? Obviously, philosophical knowledge, because philosophical knowledge is knowledge about how to live well. Right, and as we'll see, ultimately it's knowledge of the whole. Okay, but we'll see that in a little bit. And so where is wisdom? First of all, what is wisdom? Right, what is wisdom in the city? It's knowledge. What kind of knowledge? It's a kind of philosophical knowledge, right? And what is it knowledge of? It's knowledge about how to live well, and therefore knowledge about how to govern. Okay. So whatever this is, it's a kind of knowledge, Socrates says on top of 106, right? For it's surely not by lack of learning, but by knowledge that people govern well. It's through knowledge that people govern well. It's not through power, right? It's not through wealth. It's not through aristocratic bloodline, right? It's people govern by knowledge. You live well through knowledge. That's and a philosophical knowledge, okay? And then 3/4 of the way down 106, right, this conversation goes on, and Socrates says, what about this, I said? Is there in the city that we're kind of creating? Is there in the city we are just creating a kind of knowledge? Is there in the city a kind of knowledge belonging to some of the citizens that counsels not about the affairs connected with some particular thing in the city, but about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and other cities, right? Again, so wisdom is a kind of knowledge. What kind of knowledge? A kind of philosophical knowledge. What's the purpose of philosophical knowledge? Knowledge about essential concepts about what human nature is and about justice, right? And that kind of knowledge is important in the city because it provides a kind of knowledge of how to govern, right? And by the way, not to govern just one particular part, but to govern as a whole, right? And ultimately, this will become the Philosopher Kings. There's no question about this, right? But also, this is going to be the role of reason in our own minds and in our own souls. So Socrates says, what about this? Is there in the city that we're kind of developing, that's kind of emerging, right? Is there in the city that we are creating a kind of knowledge, right? And he's talking about philosophical knowledge, a kind of knowledge belonging to some of the citizens, whoever these philosopher kings are, that's who he's talking about. Is there a kind of knowledge that belongs to some of the citizens that leads them, that counsels, not about the interest or the affairs of just one part of the city, right? But about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and other cities, right? And this is the emergence of the philosopher kings, all right? And then on the bottom of the page, it's, and they're still talking about the guardians, but they're talking about the emergence of these philosopher kings, okay? He says, and it's in those rulers we just now named perfect guardians. The perfect guardians are not the noble dogs, right? The perfect guardians are the emerging philosopher kings. The perfect guardians are Glaucon and Automonchus and Polemarchus, whoever these founding philosopher kings of this new city are, right? Now, top of page 107. All right, this is where they're talking about the beginning of the philosopher kings. It is therefore, so who are these people, right? And what part of the city is this? And top of 107. It is therefore from the smallest group, right? Because there are very few philosopher kings, right? There are very few with gold in their souls. There are very few people who are destined, who have the natures to be philosophers, who are destined to be philosophers, right? And by the way, that's true, right? There are always very few intellectuals. There are always very few philosophers, and there are many Melituses, right? There are many Euthyphros. There are many Critos. There are many Melituses. There are always, right? And this is part of the deeper difficulty of the whole damn class. There are always many more who are ignorant and arrogant than those who are wise, right? There was only one Socrates, and there were thousands of Athenians. Even in this city, there's going to be thousands of laborers, thousands of guardians, and only a few philosopher kings, right? The wise are always outnumbered by the many who are ignorant and arrogant and therefore dangerous. In fact, that's why they have to build the city. That's why they have to build the city in the way that they're doing right now. Right? If you're going to have this city and it's going to be a feverish city, and it's going to be potentially populated by many people who are not by nature philosophical, who must be led by poetry and therefore a kind of noble line, who are wealthy, and these laborers are going to be wealthy ultimately, but who are dangerous, ignorant, and arrogant in their wealth, right? The city's going to be protected by these guardians who are potentially dangerous because they can never want what the city has technically. Right? And this is what Socrates is talking about. It is therefore from the smallest group and part of itself and the knowledge in it, from the supervising and ruling part, that a city founded according to nature would be wise as a whole. And this class, now he uses this word, this class, philosopher kings, this class of people who make up one of the three classes of the city, the philosopher kings, the guardians, and the laborers. And this class, which properly has a share in that knowledge, which alone among the various kinds of knowledge ought to be called wisdom, has, as it seems, the fewest members by nature. Okay, so we're seeing where justice in the feverish city emerges. It's in a kind of knowledge. What kind of knowledge? A philosophical knowledge. A kind of philosophical knowledge that allows one to govern oneself well and to govern a city well. Now, here's the argument. We're not there yet, but let me give you the punchline so we can follow it as we go through it. Philosophical knowledge, it allows you to be self-governing and allows the philosopher kings to govern well this feverish city, because one, the philosopher kings know more about knowledge and they understand the whole. They understand the relationship between the philosopher kings, the guardians, and the laborers. And they keep the whole city organized in a specific way. Just like if this is a metaphor for the soul, right? Let's now talk about the soul. In the city, we have philosopher kings, we have guardians, and we have laborers, right? In the soul, we have reason. What's the ruling part in the soul? It's reason. And by the way, it's the smallest part of the soul, right? It's reason. And reason, if you and I are self-governing, if we're living well, then we're doing that because reason, in some way, in connection, in alliance with our energy, what we would call self-discipline, our reason and our energy has made a kind of compact, made a kind of an alliance to manage and control our appetites, right? We're not run, we're not governed, we're not ruled by our passions, a kind of inferior part, right? And so this is the beginning of this argument for philosopher kings, and the way that reason kind of is the kind of the metaphor in the soul for the philosopher kings in the city. All right. So it is therefore from the smallest group and part of itself, because the philosopher kings are part of the city, right? It is therefore from the smallest group and part of itself, and the knowledge in it, from the supervising and ruling part, philosopher kings, supervising, ruling part, reason in the individual soul, supervising, ruling part, that a city founded according to nature would be wise as a whole. And this class, these philosopher kings, or reason in your own soul, and this class, which properly has a share in that knowledge, which alone among the various kinds of knowledge ought to be called wisdom. And this class, there's very few. There are always fewer intellectuals, fewer philosophers, fewer wise people than there are the arrogant and the ignorant and the dangerous. Then, by the way, this is the crisis of all politics, of humanity. This is the crisis of humanity. All right. So then they transition. Okay, so we now know what wisdom is. Where's courage? In the middle of the page. And next, courage, both itself as well as where it's situated in the city, right? That courage, thanks to which the city must be called courageous, it's not very hard to see, right? We have it. We've built these guardians, right? We've built these guardians. So 3/4 of the way down the page on 107, Socrates says, so a city is also courageous by a part of itself, right? Because the guardians are part of the city and the guardians are going to be courageous, right? And he says, so a city is also courageous by a part of itself, thanks to that part's having in a power that through everything will preserve the opinion about which things are terrible. Now, this is a little awkward, but it makes sense. That whatever this city is, it will have courage, right? Because the guardians, they've been well what? They've been well trained and they've been well educated, right? And therefore, what their training and what their education gives to them, right, is an understanding of what things need to be preserved, right? And so they become courageous, and the city has courage because the people that guard the city know what to do. They've been educated properly and they've been trained properly. Right? Now, again, I know this sounds a little awkward, but it makes perfect sense. If we were to talk now about the metaphor of the soul, if we're not going to talk about courage in the city as these guardians who have been educated and trained well and therefore know what to do, right? If we're going to talk about now the soul, this makes perfect sense, right? And what Plato's talking about, and by the way, this is what we would call self-discipline. Right? If we were to say, well, hey, that Nick Dungy, he's really self-disciplined, right? Nick Dungy is in a good way, in a platonic way, right? Which is good, right? Nick Dungy's really self-disciplined, right? And we say, well, why? Why is Nick Dungy sort of happy? Why is Nick Dungy's soul in order? Right? Why is Nick Dungy courageous in a kind of funny way? Why is Nick Dungy self-disciplined? And we'd say in this platonic sense, well, because he read Plato, right? And he learned, and Nick Dungy learned that reason is the superior and ruling part of his soul, of his existence. And he's used, and by the way, it's the superior and ruling part of reason because it's a faculty unique to human beings that connects us to what? Objective knowledge about our own nature and about justice and about how to live well. And Nick Dungy's kind of cultivated that knowledge, right? And he's used that knowledge to train himself. He's used that knowledge to educate himself in superior ways to live and inferior ways to live, right? He's trained himself how to live well. He's acquired knowledge about how to live well, not perfectly, as much as you can, right? And he's trained himself. So now he's self-disciplined, right? So now when the temptation comes, or it's the night before the final exam, but there's a big party, you don't want to miss the party. I say no. I sounds great. I'm sorry I'm going to miss it. I would love to go. No one loves to party more than me, but there's something important that I got to do tomorrow. And I've trained myself. I have self-discipline. And I have the courage. I have the courage to say no to the appetite. I have the courage to say no to the passions. I have a courage to say no to the temptation. Right? I'm courageous. I'm courageous in the face of temptation. I'm courageous in the face of passion and lust and the need for the relishes. I can say no to the things I may want but don't need. Right? And that's what courage is. Right? And that's what we call self-discipline. This makes perfect sense. Right? You are self-disciplined if you have if you've educated yourself and trained yourself properly. And educated yourself and trained yourself properly to do what? To control your passions, to control your emotions, to not be seduced by obsessing about things you want but don't need, to be governed by the inferior part of your passions and your appetite. Right? And by the way, we're in the feverish city. Remember, we're here, right? Because we found the ideal city, we found the healthy city, and then Glaucon said, yeah, this is all great, Socrates, but it's boring. Nobody wants to live here, right? You make these people live without relish. Oh, okay, right? Okay, so here we go, right? And here we are. So where's wisdom in this city? It's a kind of knowledge. What kind of knowledge? It's a kind of philosophical knowledge about how to live well. And what does that mean? That means ultimately a knowledge of the whole, of my whole being. Where's courage? Well, courage is kind of already in these guardians, but why do we call them courageous? Because they're educated well. Now, sadly, they had to be educated by a noble life. That's That's the heart of darkness of this whole damn book. Sadly, they had to be educated by a noble lot because they're noble dogs. Right? Sadly, they had to be educated by a noble lie, and they had to be intensely trained. Right? But that was necessary to keep them from to destroying the city. Just like if you're not educated and well trained, you're a danger to yourself, right? Because your passions rule you, right? You use all your energy. You use what Plato will call the spiritedness of each person, and you use it to go get the things you want but don't need, and in the process become unjust, in the process become corrupt, in the process become feverish, and then you become a danger to yourself and a danger to others. Okay, so we see now where wisdom is. We see now where courage is. Okay, now here's a really important move. From a Platonic point of view, it's quite beautiful. Here's a kind of important move. So we found wisdom, we found courage. Now, what is moderation? Right? What is moderation? Okay. And go to page 108, the bottom of 108. And now they start to talk about moderation. And where is it? Where is it in the city? And what is it? Right? And Socrates says, well, now I said, there are still two things left to find. We got to find moderation and we got to find justice. There are still two things left to find, right? That's what he means when he says there's still two things left to find. We got to find moderation and we got to find justice. And he says, well, now I said, Socrates said, there are still two left that must be seen in the city. Moderation, and that for the sake of which we are making the whole damn thing justice. All right, so what is moderation? We've got to find what moderation is. So top of page 109, 2 lines down, 3 lines down. And Socrates says, all right, so moderation, Socrates said, moderation is surely, here we go. Everything we've been talking about, the well-ordered soul, now starts to come together. Moderation is a certain kind of order and a mastery. Moderation is a certain kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires. As men say when they use, right, the phrase stronger than himself. So moderation is a kind of order and a kind of mastery. Moderation is a kind of order of this. First of all, moderation is a certain order of the city, and moderation is a certain order of the soul, right? It's a certain order of the parts, and it's a certain mastery of the passions and the desires. Okay. And by the way, this is kind of what we were just talking about, self-discipline, right? If you are self-disciplined, you're moderate, right? Your soul is in order, and you've got mastery over your appetites and your passions and your need for luxury, your need for relish, right? So moderation is a certain kind of order. The city is going to be moderate because it has the correct order. The philosopher kings rule. They make an alliance because they've educated and indoctrinated the guardians. They have a kind of control over the guardians, right? And the philosopher kings and the guardians keep control over the laborers, the passionate, part of the city. That's the order, right? When Plato talks, when sometimes you'll hear me say, you have a well-ordered soul, right? And what I mean is that your reason has made an alliance with your spirit, right? You've become self-disciplined, and you are that because you've mastered your passions and your emotions. Your soul is in order. So moderation is a kind of ordering of the parts, and it's a mastery of the passions, right? Now, right in the middle of page 109, we get the first introduction that the structure of the city, right? And by the way, do me a favor. And this is how I wish we were in class, because then I could do this on the whiteboard and it would be easier. But everybody do me a favor. Okay, so get a piece of paper. This is not going to be perfect, but we got to fucking wing it. We're on Zoom, right? So get a piece of paper in front of you, your lecture notes or whatever you have, and draw on it 2 circles. I know this is so ridiculous, but just draw on the bottom 2 circles. And on one circle on the left, write city, and on the right circle, the other circle, write soul. Do this. Here, you can see my Picasso, my Play-Doh Picasso. Right? You see that? I know this is horrible. You guys are laughing at me. Can you see that? A circle. One circle says city and one circle says soul. Now, on this, in the circle that says city, in the top, write PK. Right? Philosopher Kings, right? PK. And then right here, and look, see how the PK is a very small piece of the pie, very small piece of the circle? And then right here, right, G, right, guardians. And see how that's bigger? And then here, right, laborers, L. So the city, the circle should have PK, philosopher kings, guardians, and laborers. Remember, those are the 3 classes of the city. Some have gold in their souls, some have silver in their souls, and some have bronze in their souls, right? Okay. Now, for the soul, right, do the same thing. The structure of the soul and the structure of the city are exactly the same for Plato. But on the soul, for the individual, okay, let's just write Nick, because soul sounds so abstract, right? There's Nick. There's Nick. There's Nick's soul. And they don't mean it in the Christian sense. They mean it in our being, right? The 3 parts of our being, right? And there is reason, there's R, right? There's the superior and ruling part of my existence, right? Reason, philosopher, kings, right? And here is my spirit, right? And it is a kind of a funny word, but it means energy. Like, what's the natural energy of life, right? And everybody has this natural motivating energy, this enabling, moving energy. And the question is your energy used to support your reason, or is your energy used to pursue your passions? Right? So in the individual soul, we have reason, we have spirit, and spirit is a similar for the guardians. And then we've got passion, which is also the same as the laborers in the city. You guys see that? Right. So when Plato says, I look at this, is so ridiculous. Don't tell anybody about this. Right. So when Plato says that moderation is a certain order and mastery, this is what he's looking at. Right. The city is moderate because the philosopher kings, in a kind of alliance with the guardians, control the laborers. Just like in the individual soul, my reason, right? I have trained and educated my spirit, my energy, that's what we call self-discipline, to control my passions, right? I'm not driven by things I want that I don't need, right? The inferior part of my existence, my passions and my emotions, don't rule. So let's mute. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. And so right in the middle of 109, you get the first kind of indication of this. So moderation, top of 109, moderation is a kind of order, an order of the city and an order of the soul, and mastery of certain kind of pleasures and desires. Okay, now, but I said, Socrates says in the middle of the page, but I said, this speech looks to me as if it wants to say that concerning the soul, right? Now we're going to talk not just about the city, but the individual soul. But Socrates says, this speech looks to me, right, as if it wants to say that concerning the soul, in the same human being, there is something better and something worse. The phrase stronger than himself is used when that which is better by nature, reason in the soul, is master over that which is worse, the passions. at least it's praised. And that's what we call self-discipline. And when from bad training, right? So I don't have self-discipline, right? I don't have any self-discipline, right? I'm led by my passions. I got important things to do. I got to write my final, but boy, I got the disco. I got to go to the disco. I got to play more PlayStation, or I got to fucking buy shit on Amazon, right? I can't control my passions. I can't control my needs. I can't control my desires. And when from bad training, right? You weren't educated properly. You haven't trained yourself, which, by the way, in this culture is impossible because we're led to believe happiness is pleasure. So we're all screwed anyways. Right? And when from bad training or some association, the smaller and the better part, right? Right? You're undisciplined. You're unjust with yourself. You're feverish, right? When the better part, your reason, is mastered by the inferior multitude, it's mastered by your passions, then this, as though it were a reproach, is blamed. And the man in this condition is called weak and feverish and sick and dangerous. This is the beginning of a kind of ignorance and an arrogance. Next line down. Then Socrates says, take a glance at our young city, and you'll find one of these conditions in it. For you'll say that it is justly designated stronger than itself. It's because the philosopher kings are ruling than itself. If that in which the better rules, right? Your soul is well ordered. The city is well ordered. If the better part, the philosopher kings, or your reason rules over the worst part, your passions, right? And if it does so, you are moderate. You are self-disciplined, you are well-educated, and you're well-trained. And by the way, you're courageous because you know how to preserve what you know to be good. That's what we were talking about earlier. We were talking about what is courage. It's a kind of preserving of what one knows to be correct. And therefore, not just what one knows to be correct, but to be able to do what one must do. All right. So the alliance between the philosopher kings and the guardian, between reason and spiritedness, becomes critical, both in the city and in one's own soul. And this becomes moderation. All right. Now, here's the core argument. Justice is the result. Justice is the result of the proper ordering or the presence. Let me just say justice. Justice is the result of the proper ordering and the presence of wisdom, courage, and moderation. So this is what kind of justice is. The city is going to be just, right? Because it's going to be ruled by philosopher kings who have trained and educated the guardians in these noble lies. And so the guardians know who the master is. It's the philosopher kings. And those two forces control the laborers, control the passions. And it's the same thing in the soul, right? And we talked about this in book 2, right? You're just, right? You are just if you figure out who you are, what you're supposed to be good at, and you do it, and you share it with the city. And individually, someone is just if their reason, if Nick Dungy's reason has educated and trained my energy, my drives, and my energies to do the right thing, to know what is good and to do the right thing. And what is that? To control the passions. I know what I need to know, and I know what I need to do to live well. That's what justice is, right? And towards the bottom of page 110, right, Socrates says, well, we talked about wisdom, and we talked about courage, and we talked about moderation. And now those three things, when they come together in the proper way, that's justice, right? This is justice. So in the middle of page 111, just a kind of an indication of it, and then we'll go to page 123. Right in the middle, 433A on page 111. That rule we set down, remember, we were talking about this in book 1, book 2, he says, that rule we set down at the beginning as to what must be done in everything when we were founding the city is, in my opinion, justice. Surely we set down and often said, if you remember, that each one must practice one of the functions in the city, and that one for which his nature made him naturally most fit. And further, that justice is the minding of one's own business and not being a busybody. How funny is that? This we have both heard from many others and have often said ourselves. All right, now we're running out of time, so let's move forward a little bit. But again, on page 113, right, there's a critical discussion of the individual soul. Okay, on page, right in the middle of the page 113, there's a critical discussion about the individual soul. So don't forget that, right? And then on the bottom of 113, Socrates writes, then the just man will not be any different from the just city with respect to the form itself of justice. Okay, so the soul and the city are exactly the same. So what is justice? Okay. (123). Here we go. 123, middle of the page. Socrates says, but in truth, justice was, as it seems, something of this sort. However, not with respect to a man's minding his external business, but with respect to what is within, with respect to what truly concerns him and his own. He doesn't let each part in him, his energy or his passions, he doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business, or the three classes in the soul meddle with each other, but really sets his own house in good order and rules himself. Again, when Plato says your soul is in good order, you're just. Your reason rules. You have trained your energy to do what is correct, and you do that to control the passions. He rules his own house. His soul is in good order and rules himself. He arranges himself. The parts are arranged properly. Becomes his own friend. He's not feverish. He's not unhealthy. He's not a danger to himself. He's not a danger to others. Becomes his own friend and harmonizes the three parts. And if there are some other parts in between, he binds them together and from many makes one. All right. And the bottom of the page. All right. If we should assert that we have found the just man and just city, what justice really is in them, right? We found it, right? It is a kind of ordering of the city, and it's an ordering of the soul. Each part of the city does what it's supposed to do. The philosopher kings rule, the guardians protect and acquire, the laborers produce, right? And everybody in the city does what they're supposed to do. Now, to be sure, this is a feverish city, so they have to be told what to do through the noble lie. But it's also a metaphor for us individually. If you want to know how to be just, right? If you want to know not how to be sick, not how to be feverish, not how to be a danger to yourself and the people you love, then understand you're rational. What is reason? It's a special faculty unique to human beings that connects you to objective truth. Objective truth about what? Essential concepts like justice and courage and friendship and love, and knowledge about your own nature. And that is a superior and ruling part. If you use your reason to acquire knowledge like that, and you use that knowledge to train and educate your energy. Nick Dungy's got this vital energy, but that vital energy can be used for bad, it can be used for good, right? If I'm not self-disciplined, I used all that vital energy to go break shit, right? To do all sorts of selfish, feverish things. But if I've educated and I've trained that energy, I become self-disciplined, then I know what I need to know and I know what I need to do. And I'm therefore able to control. I'm courageous in the battle against temptation and against needs and wants, fever. And I'm just with myself because the superior part is ruling. And it's made an alliance with my vital energy and it's controlling my passions. I'm just. I am not a danger to myself. I'm not a danger to other human beings. And that is what justice is. And it's that kind of philosophical justice that governs the city. Now, to be sure, it governs it through a noble lie, right? The guardians and the laborers, to know who they are and to know what they're supposed to do, have been told the myth of the metals. It's true. It's just, to be sure, it's a noble lie. This is a kind of heart of darkness moment. But this is what would be necessary if you were to kind of moderate a sick city. And therefore, Plato, this is what Plato means by when we talk about the Republic as a kind of reflection on the limits of what's possible in politics. All right, we're out of time. Love you guys so damn much. On Thursday, we're going to do books 5 and some parts of 7, and that's it. The official lectures end on Thursday. Next Tuesday will be a review section. That's not mandatory, but we'll talk more about that on Thursday. So don't miss Thursday. And the outline for books 5 and 7 are on the course canvas page. Love you guys.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Yep. You guys have a great day, man. Love you guys. Bye.